Picture this. You're alone in the desert when a sandstorm hits like the wrath of God himself. When the dust settles, you find a dying Apache child whose people killed your husband just months before. Do you save her, or do you walk away? Sarah Beth Carson made her choice in 1882, and that choice brought 200 Apache warriors to her doorstep 3 months later, demanding an answer that would either end in peace or blood. But here's what nobody expected. That little girl would dream about Sarah's dead husband. She'd speak of messages from beyond the grave, and she'd become the bridge between two worlds that had been at war for generations. This isn't just a story about survival in the unforgiving Sonoran desert. This is the true account of how one woman's impossible choice in a moment of crisis changed the course of the Apache Wars forever. How a grieving widow and a traumatized child proved that sometimes the greatest courage isn't fighting your enemies. It's learning to love them. You see, the Apache Wars had been raging for decades. Blood for blood, vengeance for vengeance, death for death. Entire families wiped out on both sides. Children growing up knowing nothing but hatred and fear. The territorial government had put a bounty on Apache scalps, $100 each, no questions asked about whether they came from warriors or peaceful families. Sarah Beth Carson knew this cycle intimately. Just 6 months before that sandstorm, Apache raiders had swept through her ranch like the angel of death itself. They'd killed her husband James in their own front yard, left him scalped and mutilated as a message for any other whites who thought they could claim Apache land. Sarah had buried him with her own hands, the ground so hard from drought that it took her all night to dig deep enough. She'd sworn that day, standing over his grave with dirt under her fingernails and hate in her heart, that she'd never show mercy to an Apache. Not ever. They were savages, animals, enemies of everything decent and civilized. The only good Indian was a dead Indian, just like everyone said. But the desert has its own laws, and sometimes those laws demand you choose between who you've been and who you might become. The desert doesn't forgive. It doesn't negotiate. And on that scorching July afternoon in 1882, when the wind turned from a whisper to a roar and the sky disappeared behind a wall of sand, the Sonoran Desert was preparing to test every soul caught in its fury, to strip away everything except the core of who they really were. Sarah Beth Carson felt the storm coming in her bones before she saw it. The air had gone still, heavy with the kind of silence that makes horses nervous and sends lizards scurrying for cover. She was 3 miles from Tucson, returning from the trading post with supplies loaded on her pack mule, when the horizon began to eat itself. She'd made this trip dozens of times since James died. It was the only way to get flour, coffee, ammunition, the basics that kept her alive in her self-imposed exile. She couldn't bear to be around other people anymore. Their sympathy felt like pity. Their advice felt like judgment. Their presence reminded her of everything she'd lost. So she lived alone, 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, in the adobe house James had built with his own hands during the hopeful early days of their marriage. She tended her struggling garden, maintained her weapons, and counted the days until she could join her husband in whatever came after this harsh, unforgiving life. But the desert had other plans. What happened next would echo through history, but it started with a sound that shouldn't have been there, a sound that would force Sarah to choose between her past and her future, between hatred and hope, between walking away and walking toward the most dangerous act of mercy the Arizona Territory had ever seen. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest storms of all. Sometimes one moment of choosing love over hate can change the course of nations. And sometimes the most powerful weapon against centuries of war isn't a rifle or a treaty. It's a grieving woman who decides that some things are more important than revenge. First came the smell, earth and sage torn loose from their moorings. Then the sound, like a freight train bearing down from hell itself. Sarah squinted through the heat shimmer and saw it, a wall of sand and debris stretching from earth to sky, rolling toward her with the patience of inevitability. The storm hit like the end of the world. Sand filled her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. The wind screamed like a banshee, drowning out thought and reason. Her mule panicked, broke free, disappeared into the chaos with all her supplies. Sarah pressed herself against a boulder and held on, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. When the roar finally faded and Sarah dared to open her eyes, she found herself pressed against a boulder, coated in grit that made breathing an effort. The mule was gone, along with her supplies, but she was alive. That's when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the post-storm quiet, a sound that would test everything she thought she knew about right and wrong, about justice and mercy, about the price of hatred and the cost of love. A child crying. Sarah's first instinct was caution. Apache raiders had been active in the territory for months. The cavalry said they were getting desperate, taking risks they wouldn't have taken before. Finding a child alone in the desert could be a trap. She'd heard stories of warriors using women and children as bait, luring good-hearted settlers into ambushes that left nothing but bones for the buzzards. But the crying continued, weak and hopeless, and Sarah's second instinct, the one that had made her a school teacher before the desert claimed that life too, overruled the first. That sound wasn't tactical, it was pure human suffering, and it called to something deeper than fear or caution. She followed the sound past a cluster of prickly pear cacti, their purple fruit hanging heavy in the afternoon heat, around an outcropping of red rock that looked like it had been carved by ancient gods, to where the storm had deposited its strangest cargo, an overturned army supply wagon, its wheels still spinning lazily in the settling dust. The crying was coming from underneath. Sarah approached slowly, her hand resting on the pistol at her hip. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. James had taught her to shoot before the Apache came, back when they thought the biggest danger they'd face was coyotes getting into the chickens. Now she could put 6 shots in a playing card at 20 paces, a skill she'd never wanted to learn but had needed to survive. "Hello?" she called softly. "Anyone hurt under there?" The crying stopped. Sarah held her breath, listening to the desert's post-storm quiet, the settling of disturbed earth, the distant complaint of her missing mule, the whisper of wind through sage. Then so quietly she almost missed it, came a whisper in a language she didn't understand but recognized. Apache. Every muscle in Sarah's body went rigid. Her husband's face flashed before her eyes. James Carson, laughing over breakfast just hours before the Apache war party, swept through their ranch like a summer storm, brutal and fast and merciless. She could still see the blood on the kitchen floor, still hear the silence that followed the screaming, still remember the weight of his body when she'd found him in the yard, scalped and mutilated, left as a message for any other whites who thought they could claim Apache land. She should walk away, leave whatever child was trapped under that wagon to face the desert alone. It would be justice, wouldn't it? An eye for an eye, a life for a life. The Apache had taken everything from her, her husband, her future, her faith in the basic decency of the world. Why should she show mercy to one of theirs? But when she looked at the wagon, really looked at it, she saw something that stopped her cold. This wasn't an Apache raid scene. The wagon bore army markings, blue and yellow paint still visible under the coating of dust. But the bodies scattered nearby weren't soldiers. They were Apache. Men, women, elders. All shot, all scalped, all left for the buzzards in the democratic spirit of frontier justice. Sarah's stomach lurched. She'd heard the stories whispered in town, rumors of bounty hunters who didn't much care whether the Apache they killed were warriors or peaceful families. $100 for every scalp, no questions asked. Governor's orders. Clean up the territory by any means necessary. Looking at the scene now, the old woman with her braids cut away, the man who couldn't have been much older than James, the teenage boy whose paint had been washed away by his own blood, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't war. This was slaughter. The crying started again, weaker now, more desperate. Sarah holstered her pistol and grabbed the wagon's side. "Hold on, honey," she called, surprised by the gentleness in her own voice. "I'm getting you out." The wagon was heavier than it looked, loaded with supplies that had spilled across the desert floor. Sacks of flour torn open and emptying into the sand, tools scattered like bones, water barrels cracked and leaking their precious contents into the thirsty earth. It took 20 minutes of pushing and levering with a piece of broken axle, but finally the wagon shifted enough for Sarah to see underneath. Curled in the small space, covered in dust and dried blood that wasn't all her own, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Her long black hair was matted with dirt and gore. Her traditional Apache dress, the kind Sarah had seen in illustrations but never up close, torn and stained with things she didn't want to identify. The child's small moccasins were worn through at the soles, suggesting she'd been walking for days before the massacre. But her eyes, dark brown and alert despite everything, fixed on Sarah's face with an intensity that took her breath away. Those weren't the eyes of a typical 4-year-old. They held too much knowledge, too much pain, too much understanding of what the world could do to innocence. They were the eyes of someone who had seen her family murdered and somehow found the strength to keep breathing. "It's all right," Sarah whispered, reaching slowly toward the child. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl flinched but didn't pull away when Sarah's fingers touched her arm. Her skin was burning with fever, dry and hot as desert stone. She was severely dehydrated, probably hadn't had water in days. Without immediate help, she would die in this hole, another casualty of a war that seemed to have no end and no winners. Sarah lifted her out carefully, noting the way the child's small body went rigid with fear. Every muscle was tense, ready to flee or fight despite her weakness. This little girl had learned not to trust, had learned that safety was an illusion and kindness often came with a price. "I know," Sarah murmured, settling the girl against her chest. "I know you're scared. I know you don't know if I'm safe, but you're going to be all right now. I promise." The child weighed almost nothing, like a bird with hollow bones. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her small heart racing like a trapped rabbit's. As Sarah held her, she could feel the fever radiating through the torn fabric of the Apache dress, could smell the desert dust and dried blood and something else, the sweet, sickly scent of infection. The ride back to Sarah's homestead passed in a blur of heat and worry. Her horse, a steady mare named Belle, seemed to sense the urgency and picked her way carefully through the desert debris left by the storm. The child, Sarah found herself thinking of her as Little Bird, though she had no idea why, drifted in and out of consciousness, her small hands clutching Sarah's shirt with surprising strength whenever awareness returned. Each time the girl woke, her dark eyes would dart around frantically before settling on Sarah's face. There was always a moment of panic, of remembering before something in Sarah's expression seemed to reassure her. Not complete trust, that would take time, but a tentative willingness to accept this stranger's help. Sarah's place wasn't much to look at, a sturdy adobe house her husband had built with his own hands, brick by brick in the early days of their marriage when they still believed the desert could be tamed with enough hard work and determination. A well that ran clean and deep, fed by an underground spring James had found by following animal tracks during the dry season. A garden that struggled against the desert heat, but managed to produce enough to keep her fed through the winter months. The property was isolated 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, which had once felt like a blessing. No busybodies dropping by unannounced, no borrowed tools that never found their way home, no gossip traveling faster than wildfire through a community of bored settlers. Now it felt like a responsibility. If something happened to the child, if her fever spiked or her wounds became infected, Sarah would be on her own. She carried Little Bird inside, laying her on the narrow bed in the spare room that had once been meant for the children she and James never had. The irony wasn't lost on her. After years of trying and failing to conceive, she was finally playing mother to a child whose people had killed her husband. The girl's eyes followed her every movement, wary but no longer actively terrified. Sarah could see intelligence there, a quick mind already cataloging escape routes and potential threats. This child had survived something terrible by staying alert, by never fully letting her guard down. "Water first," Sarah said, more to herself than to the child. "Then we'll see about getting you cleaned up." She fetched a cup from the kitchen, filled it from the pitcher she kept on the washstand. The water was warm but clean, drawn fresh from the well that morning. When she held it to the girl's lips, the child drank greedily, water spilling down her chin in her desperation. Sarah had to pull the cup away twice to keep her from making herself sick. "Slow, honey," she murmured. "It's not going anywhere. There's plenty more where that came from." When the immediate thirst was satisfied, Sarah began the careful process of cleaning the worst of the dirt and blood away. She heated water on the stove, added a handful of salt to help fight infection, gathered clean cloths and the bottle of carbolic acid she kept for emergencies. Most of the blood wasn't little bird's. It belonged to the family members who had died around her, whose bodies had sheltered her when the wagon overturned. But her left shoulder bore a long, shallow cut that had started to fester. Angry red lines radiating out from the wound, like the fingers of infection reaching toward her heart. Sarah cleaned it as gently as she could, murmuring apologies when the child whimpered. "I know it hurts, sweetheart, but we have to get it clean or it'll get worse. Can you be brave for me?" As she worked, Sarah found herself studying the girl's face. High cheekbones that would be striking when she grew up, a stubborn chin that suggested a strong will, eyes that seemed far too old for such a young face. She was beautiful, even dirty and frightened and half dead from thirst. She would grow up to be a heartbreaker, assuming the dessert let her grow up at all. The Apache dress was beyond saving, so Sarah cut it away carefully, preserving the beadwork and symbols that obviously held meaning. She dressed the child in one of her own nightgowns, rolled up and tied to fit the small frame. The cotton was soft and clean, probably the finest fabric the girl had ever worn, if she lived that long. As the sun set outside the small window, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Sarah why she'd fallen in love with this harsh land in the first place, she settled into the chair beside the bed for what she knew would be a long night. That first night, Sarah didn't sleep. She sat beside the bed watching the rise and fall of Little Bird's chest, checking her temperature every hour, offering water whenever the child stirred. The fever came in waves, sometimes burning so hot that Sarah feared it would cook the girl's brain, other times dropping low enough to make her shiver like autumn leaves. Twice the fever spiked high enough to send the girl into delirious mumbling, always in Apache, always words Sarah couldn't understand, but recognized as distressed. The child would thrash in the bed, calling out what sounded like names. "Amma," she would cry. "Amma, where are you?" Sarah didn't need a translator to know the girl was calling for her mother. During those moments, Sarah would hold her down gently, murmuring reassurances in English that the child couldn't understand, but seemed to find comforting anyway. "Shh, sweetheart. You're safe. You're going to be all right. I'm here." The house creaked around them, settling into the cooler desert night. Outside, coyotes sang their wild songs to the moon, and somewhere in the distance an owl called with the voice of the desert itself. Sarah had grown to love these sounds over the years. They meant home, meant solitude, meant a kind of peace that could only be found far from the noise and judgment of other people. But tonight, listening to the child's labored breathing, the animal sounds felt ominous, predators stalking through the darkness, death moving on silent paws across the sand. She found herself checking and rechecking the rifle propped against the wall, making sure the front door was barred, peering through the curtains at shadows that might or might not be moving in the moonlight. By morning, the fever had broken. Sarah woke slumped in her chair to find Little Bird sitting up in bed, watching her with those unsettling dark eyes. The girl looked better. The flush was gone from her cheeks, and her breathing had returned to normal. But there was something else in her expression now, a wariness that hadn't been there before, as if sleep had given her time to remember where she was and who was taking care of her. They regarded each other in silence for a long moment, this white woman and Apache child, each taking the measure of the other. Sarah had expected fear, maybe hostility. What she saw instead was caution mixed with curiosity, like a wild animal deciding whether this human could be trusted. "Are you hungry?" Sarah asked finally. Little Bird tilted her head but didn't respond. The gesture was bird-like, alert, intelligent. Sarah tried sign language, the basic gestures she'd learned trading with various tribes over the years. When she signed "eat," the girl's eyes lit up with understanding, and she nodded eagerly. Breakfast was awkward but not unfriendly. Sarah made Johnny cakes and weak coffee, keeping the portions small to avoid overwhelming Little Bird's empty stomach. The child ate with careful attention, as if memorizing the taste of each bite, the texture of food that wasn't dried meat or pemmican or whatever the Apache survived on during their long journeys across the desert. Sarah found herself studying the girl as she ate, noting details she'd missed during the crisis of the previous day. The child's hands were small but calloused, Speaking of a life where even 4-year-olds were expected to work, her table manners were better than Sarah had expected. Not refined by white standards, but there was a dignity to the way she ate, a respect for the food that spoke of people who understood hunger. "What's your name?" Sarah asked, even though she knew the child wouldn't understand the words. She touched her own chest. "Sarah." Little Bird watched her mouth form the word, then touched her own small chest and said something in Apache that sounded like water over stones, musical and flowing in a way that English never quite managed. "I can't say that," Sarah admitted. "My tongue doesn't know how to make those sounds. Mind if I call you Little Bird? Just until I figure out how to say your real name properly." Something that might have been amusement flickered in the child's eyes. She repeated Sarah carefully, her accent thick but the pronunciation recognizable. "That's right," Sarah encouraged. "Sarah. And you're Little Bird." The girl shook her head and said her Apache name again, more slowly this time, as if teaching a particularly slow student. Then she pointed at Sarah and said Sarah with growing confidence. It was the beginning of communication, tentative and limited but real. Over the following days, as Little Bird regained her strength, they developed their own mixture of English words, Apache phrases, and sign language that neither of them fully understood, but somehow managed to convey basic needs and simple ideas. The days that followed established a rhythm. Sarah worked in the garden while Little Bird watched from the shade of the ramada, slowly regaining strength. The child was unnaturally quiet. Sarah never heard her laugh or cry or make the normal sounds of a 4-year-old at play. But she was observant, absorbing everything. How Sarah drew water from the well, how she prepared food, how she tended the struggling vegetables that refused to admit the desert had defeated them. Sarah's garden was her pride, and her persistence made manifest. In a land where most plants withered and died, she had coaxed tomatoes, beans, and squash to grow. It took constant attention, watering twice a day during the hot months, building shade structures to protect tender plants from the murderous desert sun, fighting an ongoing war against insects and small animals, who saw her vegetables as a rare feast. Little Bird seemed fascinated by the process. She would sit very still, watching Sarah check each plant for signs of disease or pest damage, noting which ones got extra water and which were allowed to dry out slightly between waterings. When Sarah moved her chair to keep pace with the shifting shade, Little Bird moved too, maintaining her silent vigil. On the 4th day, something changed. Sarah was weeding around the tomato plants when she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Little Bird had left her chair and was crouched beside a struggling bean plant, her small fingers gently touching the wilted leaves. "That one's not doing so well," Sarah said, more to fill the silence than because she expected the child to understand. Little Bird looked up at her, then back at the plant. She said something in Apache, her tone questioning. Sarah shrugged. "I don't know what's wrong with it. Too much sun, maybe. Or not enough water. Plants are mysterious things." The girl stood and walked to the well. Sarah watched, puzzled, as Little Bird cranked the bucket up from the depths, struggling with the weight but managing to bring up a half-full container of cool, clear water. She dragged it back to the bean plant and looked at Sarah expectantly. "You want to water it?" Sarah asked. Little Bird nodded solemnly. Sarah found a smaller container and showed the child how to pour water slowly around the base of the plant, soaking the soil without washing away the roots. Little Bird copied her movements exactly, her small face serious with concentration. It started small after that, picking up tools Sarah had set down, holding bowls steady while Sarah stirred. By the end of the week, she was following Sarah around like a small, silent shadow, anticipating what was needed before Sarah asked for it. The child seemed to have an instinctive understanding of plants and animals that impressed Sarah. She could tell when the chickens were agitated, moving slowly and calmly around them instead of the quick, jerky movements that might spook them into flight. She knew which vegetables were ready for harvesting and which needed more time, somehow reading signs that Sarah had to consciously look for. They developed their own language of gestures and expressions. Little Bird learned to shake her head for no and nod for yes. Sarah learned that the child preferred cornbread to Johnny cakes, that she was afraid of sudden movements but comfortable with gradual ones, and that she had an almost supernatural ability to know when someone was approaching the homestead long before they came into view. The girl's English improved with startling speed, as if she were remembering rather than learning. Individual words at first: water, food, horse, then simple phrases: Sarah hungry? Bird help? Where mama? That last question was the hardest to answer. Sarah tried sign language, simple drawings in the dirt, anything to explain what had happened without traumatizing the child further. But Little Bird seemed to understand more than she let on. Sometimes Sarah would catch her staring toward the horizon with an expression of loss that was heartbreaking in someone so young. But it was on the 8th night that everything changed. Sarah woke to find Little Bird standing beside her bed, small hand on her shoulder, eyes wide with something that looked like fear mixed with wonder. The child was trembling, but not from cold. The desert nights were still warm in July. "What is it, honey?" Sarah whispered, sitting up. Little Bird took her hand and pulled her toward the window. Outside, the desert stretched empty under a sky blazing with stars. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the landscape and making the distant mountains look like sleeping giants. Sarah saw nothing unusual, but the child pressed her small body against Sarah's side and pointed toward the horizon with a shaking finger. "Man," Little Bird whispered in English, her first word in Sarah's language that wasn't a simple noun or request. "Good man. Says sorry." Sarah's blood chilled. She strained her eyes, searching the moonlit desert for any sign of movement. What man? Where? But when she looked again, the desert remained empty. No riders, no figures moving among the cacti, no glint of metal or flash of movement. Just the eternal stillness of the high country under starlight. Little Bird, however, seemed calm by whatever she had seen or thought she had seen. She allowed Sarah to lead her back to bed and fell asleep almost immediately, her small face peaceful in a way it hadn't been since Sarah found her. Sarah lay awake until dawn, her husband's old rifle across her knees, watching the horizon. Nothing moved except the wind through the sage and the occasional flight of bats hunting insects in the pre-dawn darkness. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer alone. The next morning brought visitors, real ones this time. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching from the east. She quickly gathered Little Bird, who had been helping sort the wet clothes, and brought her inside. "Stay here," she told the child firmly. "Don't let anyone see you." Little Bird nodded seriously and disappeared into the pantry, pulling the door almost shut behind her. The visitors turned out to be Ezra and Martha Hendricks, her nearest neighbors. They owned a small ranch about 15 miles east, closer to the main road that connected Tucson to the mining settlements in the mountains. Ezra was a weathered man in his 50s who had served with distinction in the territorial militia. Martha was younger, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing and a tongue that could strip paint at 50 yards. "Sarah, dear," Martha called as she climbed down from the wagon seat. "We heard about the storm and wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine," Sarah replied, stepping onto the porch but not inviting them inside. "Lost my pack mule and some supplies, but the house weathered it just fine." Ezra was looking around the yard with the systematic attention of a man who had spent years watching for Apache sign. His eyes lingered on the areas where Little Bird's small footprints might be visible in the dirt. "See any strangers around?" he asked casually. "Storm like that, sometimes folks get turned around, end up where they don't belong." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "Just the usual desert creatures." "Why? Someone missing?" Martha stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There was a massacre, Sarah. Apache family traveling under Army protection. Bounty hunters caught up with them about 20 miles from here." "That's terrible," Sarah managed, hoping her voice sounded appropriately shocked. "Found the wagon yesterday," Ezra continued. "Whole family dead except for one. Little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old. Tracks suggest she wandered off before the shooting started, but we lost the trail in the storm." "You think she's still alive?" Sarah asked. Martha shrugged. "Desert's not kind to children alone. But if she is, and if she shows up here, you need to be careful. Apache children grow up wild. No telling what one might do if it's scared and hungry." "I'll keep my eyes open," Sarah promised. After they left, Sarah found Little Bird crouched in the pantry, her dark eyes wide with understanding. The child had learned enough English to follow the basic meaning of the conversation. "They looking for me?" Little Bird said quietly. Sarah knelt down to the child's level. "Yes, but I won't let them take you." "Why?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything. All the reasons Little Bird had to distrust white people, all the evidence that suggested Sarah should turn her over to the authorities. Sarah looked at this brave, intelligent, traumatized child and felt something settle in her chest. "Because you're safe here. Because you belong here now." Little Bird studied her face for a long moment, then reached out and took Sarah's hand. "Thank you, Sarah Mama." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Sarah Mama. Not just Sarah, but Mama. The child had claimed her as family, had chosen to trust despite every reason not to. That night, for the first time since James's death, Sarah cried. Not the bitter tears of grief and rage she'd wept before, but something cleaner, more hopeful. She wept for the child who had lost everything, for the family who had died in the desert, for the husband she would always miss. But mostly she wept with relief. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't alone. Angry in your eyes sometimes. Sarah looked at this impossible child, wise beyond her years, and felt something crack open in her chest. "Yes, I'm angry, but not at you." That Little Bird seemed to consider this. Then she reached out and touched Sarah's hand with her small dusty fingers. "Good man says anger makes poison in heart, says love makes medicine." "What good man?" "Your man. He comes in dreams. Says he's sorry for making you sad." Sarah's vision blurred. She blinked hard, swallowing against the sudden thickness in her throat. "You dream about my husband?" "He has kind eyes, like you, but different color. He says tell you, desert take many things, but love it cannot take." Sarah stared at this child who spoke like an oracle, who dreamed of dead men and offered comfort with the wisdom of ages. "How could you possibly know what he looked like?" Little Bird shrugged, a gesture heartbreakingly childlike, despite everything else about her. "He shows me, in here." She touched her small chest. "Says you hurt too long. Says time for healing." That afternoon, while Little Bird napped in the shade, Sarah found herself at the small grave behind the house where she'd buried James's few remaining possessions, the things the Apache hadn't burned. She knelt in the dust, her hands flat against the hot earth. "Is she right?" she whispered to the silence. "Are you trying to tell me something?" The desert offered no answers, but for the first time since James's death, Sarah felt a loosening in her chest, a space where breath could move freely. When she returned to the house, Little Bird was sitting on the front step, playing with a corn husk doll Sarah had made for her. She looked up when Sarah approached. "Sarah said about good man?" "Yes, honey, I miss him very much." Little Bird nodded solemnly. "I miss my people too. Mama, Papa, Grandmother, who told stories." Her small face crumpled for just a moment before she visibly pulled herself together. "But they gone to spirit world. Good man says we must live in this world now." Sarah sat beside her on the step, this child who carried the weight of loss with such dignity it shamed her. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think he's right." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the desert stretch toward the mountains in the distance. Somewhere out there, Sarah knew, Apache scouts were searching. They would come eventually. The question was whether Sarah would be ready to give up the child who had become, without her quite realizing it, the center of her world. As if reading her thoughts, Little Bird spoke again. "They come soon. My people." Sarah's heart lurched. "How do you know?" "I feel them in the wind. Papa looks for me." She turned those dark, knowing eyes to Sarah. "You scared?" Sarah considered lying, then decided this child deserved honesty. "Yes. I'm scared they'll take you away." "You want me stay?" The simple question pierced Sarah like an arrow. She looked at this little girl who had wandered into her life during a sandstorm and somehow managed to heal wounds Sarah hadn't even known were festering. "Yes," she whispered. "I want you to stay forever." Little Bird smiled, the first real smile Sarah had seen from her. "Then I ask Papa. I tell him, you good mama, that you saved me when spirit world almost take me. What if he says no?" Little Bird considered this with her characteristic seriousness. Then I show him dreams. Show him good man who says love stronger than hate. Show him how you choose healing over hurting. 3 weeks after Sarah found Little Bird, the visitors came. Sarah spotted the dust cloud first, a smudge on the horizon that grew steadily larger. Not a supply wagon or a cavalry patrol. The movement was wrong for that. This was a war party, riding hard but not scattered. Organized. Purposeful. "Little Bird," she called softly. The child was feeding the chickens, but she looked up immediately at Sarah's tone. "Inside. Now." Little Bird didn't argue. She set down the tin of corn and walked quickly to the house, her small face grave. She'd been expecting this too. Sarah checked her rifle, made sure her pistol was loaded, and stepped onto the front porch. If today was the day she died, she'd meet it standing. The riders crested the ridge like a wave of shadow and dust. Not 30 or 40 warriors as Sarah had expected, but more, many more. The line stretched across the desert floor like a dark river. Warriors mounted on painted ponies, weapons glinting in the afternoon sun. At their head rode a man Sarah didn't recognize from any wanted posters, but whose bearing spoke of absolute authority. This wasn't just a war party. This was a chief, and he'd brought what looked like half his tribe. They stopped just outside rifle range and waited. Sarah had heard that many Apache leaders could speak English when they chose to. She decided to test that theory. "I'm not looking for trouble," she called across the desert. "Just a woman trying to make an honest living." One of the warriors urged his horse forward, a man in his 30s with a scar across his left cheek and eyes like chips of obsidian. He stopped 20 yards from the porch. "You have something that belongs to us," he said in accented but clear English. Sarah's mouth went dry, but before she could respond, Little Bird's voice came from behind her, soft but carrying clearly in the desert air. "Papa." The warrior's composure cracked. His eyes went wide, and something that might have been relief flickered across his features before discipline reasserted itself. He dismounted and walked slowly toward the porch, his hands clearly visible and empty. Little Bird stepped out from behind Sarah, small and brave and heartbreaking in her faded calico dress. She spoke in rapid Apache, words Sarah couldn't understand but recognized as urgent, explanatory. The warrior listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up at Sarah. "My daughter tells me you saved her life," he said, his voice careful, formal. "That you fed her when she was hungry, gave her water when she thirsted, tended her wounds when she was hurt." Sarah found her voice. "Any decent person would have done the same." "No," he said quietly. "They would not. We have found the wagon, seen the bodies of our people. We know what happened to them. What would have happened to her if you had not come?" He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, this Apache warrior looking up at the white woman who had cared for his child. "I am called Tokala. She is my daughter Ayana. Her mother and grandmother died in the attack. I thought I had lost her too." "Ayana," Sarah repeated, tasting the name. "It's beautiful. What does it mean?" "Eternal blossom. My wife chose it because she said our daughter would bring beauty to harsh places." Sarah looked down at Little Bird, at Ayana, and felt her heart crack a little wider. "She does." Tokala studied Sarah's face for a long moment. "You care for her?" It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "Yes. She is Apache. You are white. Your people and mine are at war." "Yes. Yet you would keep her?" Sarah looked at Ayana, this child who had wandered into her life during a sandstorm and somehow managed to heal wounds Sarah hadn't even known were festering. "If she wanted to stay, if you allowed it." Tokala was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, measured. "My daughter has told me many things. About your kindness, your patience, about the dreams she has had." He paused, studying Sarah's face. "She says the spirit of your dead husband comes to her, tells her you are to be trusted." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "She's a child. She doesn't understand." "She understands more than you think." Tokala's expression was grave. "Ayana has always seen things others cannot. It is a gift and a burden. The spirits speak to her because she listens. He looked toward the horizon, where the rest of his war party waited in disciplined silence. Sarah could see them clearly now. Not just warriors, but women and children too. An entire community, come to reclaim one of their own. I came here to take my daughter home, Tokala continued, but she tells me this is home now, that you need her as much as she needs you. Sarah's throat closed. She looked down at Ayana, who was watching the exchange with those two old eyes. What are you saying? Tokala stepped closer, his voice dropping to carry only between them. I am saying that the Apache way honors debts of the heart as much as debts of blood. You saved my daughter's life. More than that, you have given her love when she had lost everything else. That cannot be repaid with horses or silver. He paused, his gaze moving between Sarah and Ayana. But neither can I abandon her to live among people who would see her heritage as a mark of shame. She is Apache. She must know her people, her traditions, her history. Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Then what do we do? Ayana spoke up then, her small voice cutting through the adult conversation with startling clarity. I stay with Sarah when leaves fall and snow comes. I go with Papa when sun grows strong and desert blooms. I am bridge between worlds, like grandmother said I would be. Both adults stared at her. Tokala was the first to find his voice. You would choose to live in both worlds? Ayana nodded seriously. Sarah teaches me white woman ways. Papa teaches me Apache ways. I learn all things, help both peoples understand. She looked between them with absolute certainty. Good man in dreams says this is path for healing. Sarah looked at Tokala, this Apache warrior who had every right to take his daughter and disappear into the desert forever. What do you think? Tokala was quiet for a long time, his eyes moving between Sarah and Ayana. Behind him, Sarah could see other Apache dismounting, setting up what looked like a temporary camp. They weren't planning to leave quickly. Finally, Tokala nodded slowly. I think the spirits have been planning this longer than any of us realized. The arrangements they worked out were unlike anything the Arizona Territory had ever seen. Ayana would spend the hot months with her father and the Apache, learning the old ways, the traditional skills, the history of her people. When the seasons turned and the desert cooled, she would return to Sarah's homestead to learn reading and writing, arithmetic and English, the skills she would need to navigate the white world. It wasn't a perfect solution. There would be questions from both sides, suspicion and outright hostility from people who couldn't understand how a white woman and an Apache warrior could trust each other with something as precious as a child's future. But it was a beginning. On the day Ayana left with her father for the first time, Sarah stood on her porch watching them ride toward the mountains. The child looked back once, raised her small hand in farewell, and called out in her clear voice, I come back when cottonwoods turn gold, Sarah Mama. Sarah Mama. The title hit her like a physical blow, sweet and painful at the same time. That evening, alone in her house for the first time in over a month, Sarah sat at her kitchen table and tried to remember what silence used to feel like. The corn-husk doll Ayana had left behind lay on the windowsill, catching the last rays of sunlight. Sarah picked it up, held it against her chest, and, for the first time since James died, allowed herself to cry. Not the bitter tears of grief and rage she'd wept before, but something cleaner, sadder, and somehow hopeful. The desert had taken much from her, but it had given her something too. A daughter who called her Mama, a warrior who trusted her with his most precious treasure, and a purpose that felt larger than her own small life. 3 months later, as the cottonwoods along the distant creek began to show their first hints of gold, Sarah spotted a familiar dust cloud on the horizon. This time, her heart leaped with joy instead of fear. Ayana came running across the desert, her hair longer now, her skin darker from the sun, but her smile bright as starlight. She launched herself into Sarah's arms with the enthusiasm of a child who had spent too long being patient and proper. Sarah, Mama, I missed you every day. Sarah held her tight, breathing in the smell of sage and wood smoke that clung to her hair. I missed you too, little bird. Tell me everything. And Ayana did. Over dinner and into the evening, she chattered about life with the Apache, the horses she'd learned to ride, The basket weaving techniques her aunt had taught her, the stories her grandmother's sister told around the fire at night. Her English had improved dramatically, and she peppered her account with Apache words that Sarah slowly began to recognize. Papa says I grow wise in both worlds, Ayana announced proudly. Says I will be voice for understanding when people's ready to listen. And are they? Sarah asked. Ready to listen? Ayana considered this with her characteristic seriousness. Some, not all, but Papa says change comes like dawn, slow, then all at once. That winter was different from any Sarah had known. The house filled with laughter, with Ayana's questions and observations, with the particular chaos that came with raising a curious, intelligent child. Sarah taught her to read using her few precious books, and Ayana devoured them with hunger that reminded Sarah why she'd become a teacher in the first place. But Ayana taught Sarah things too. How to read the desert's moods, how to find water where none seemed to exist, how to prepare traditional Apache foods that made better use of the desert's resources than anything Sarah had learned from white settlements. More importantly, she taught Sarah how to let the past rest without forgetting it. Good man still comes in dreams sometimes, Ayana mentioned one evening as they worked together preparing dinner. He happy now, says his heart knows you safe and loved. Sarah's hand stilled on the cornbread she was mixing. You still dream about James? Sometimes, less now. He says his work finished when I learned to love you like daughter loves mother. Ayana looked up with those wise, dark eyes. Says now he can rest. Spring came early that year, and with it, Tokala's return. But this time, he didn't come alone. A small group of Apache families traveled with him. Not warriors, but men and women who had grown curious about the white woman who cared for one of their children, who had somehow convinced their war leader that peace might be possible. They camped respectfully distant from Sarah's homestead, but close enough that Ayana could move freely between the two worlds. Sarah found herself hosting tentative visits, sharing meals with Apache mothers who taught her their traditional plant medicine in exchange for lessons in preserving food for longer winters. The language barrier was significant, but Ayana served as translator, her young voice bridging gaps that had seemed impossible to cross. Slowly, carefully, understanding began to grow. It wasn't always smooth. There were moments of suspicion, cultural misunderstandings that led to hurt feelings or angry words. Some of the Apache elders remained convinced that any contact with whites would corrupt their traditions. Some of the white settlers in distant Tucson grumbled about Sarah's Indian sympathies and muttered about betrayal. But the children adapted fastest, as children always do. Soon Apache youngsters were playing with homemade toys Sarah showed them how to make, while Ayana taught white children traditional games during the rare occasions when neighbors visited. One afternoon, as Sarah watched a mixed group of children splashing in the creek that ran near her property during a rare summer rain, she realized something profound had happened. Without anyone quite planning it, they had created something new. A small community where Apache and white cultures met and mingled, where children grew up seeing each other as playmates rather than enemies. It wasn't going to spread overnight. The territorial wars were still raging, and there was too much blood and mistrust for widespread peace to take hold quickly. But here, in this small pocket of the desert, two worlds had found a way to coexist. And at the center of it all was Ayana, now growing into a young woman, fluent in both languages, equally comfortable discussing Apache spiritual beliefs and American historical events. She moved between cultures with the ease of someone who belonged to both and was limited by neither. Years passed. The arrangement continued, refined by experience and deepened by trust. Ayana grew from a child into a young woman, her unusual upbringing making her a natural diplomat, a bridge builder, a voice for understanding in a world that too often chose conflict over cooperation. Sarah aged too, her dark hair showing silver, her hands growing rough from years of desert life. But she was content in a way she had never expected to be again after James's death. She had found purpose in raising a child who belonged to two worlds, in helping two peoples understand each other, in proving that love could be stronger than hatred. When Ayana turned 16, territorial officials came calling. Word of the unusual arrangement had spread, and there were questions about the legality of a white woman raising an Apache child, concerns about civilizing influences, and proper education. Sarah faced them down with the quiet steel she'd developed over years of desert living. That girl speaks 3 languages, can read and write better than most adults in Tucson, knows more about desert survival than your best scouts, and has helped negotiate peaceful contact between 2 peoples who've been at war for decades. If that's not proper education, I'd like to know what is. The officials left without Ayana, but the attention brought changes. Other families, both Apache and white, began seeking out Sarah's homestead. Some came looking for medical help. Sarah had developed a reputation as a skilled healer, combining traditional Apache plant medicine with frontier remedies. Others came seeking Ayana's translation services or hoping to arrange peaceful meetings between communities. What had started as one woman saving one child had grown into something larger, a place where 2 cultures could meet on neutral ground, where understanding could flourish despite centuries of mistrust. Ayana, now fluent in multiple Apache dialects as well as English, became an unofficial ambassador. She traveled between settlements, carrying messages, negotiating trade agreements, helping resolve disputes before they could escalate into violence. She's becoming what her grandmother predicted, Tokala told Sarah during one of his visits, a bridge between worlds, a voice for peace. Sarah watched Ayana working with a group of mixed children, teaching them a game that combined elements from both cultures. She's becoming what this territory needs, she replied, what we all need. On Ayana's 18th birthday, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the young woman asked a question that had been building for years. Sarah, Mama, do you ever regret it, taking me in that day? Sarah looked at this beautiful, wise, strong young woman who called her mother, who had brought such richness to her life, who had healed wounds she hadn't even known needed healing. Never, she said firmly, not for a single moment. Ayana smiled, that brilliant expression that still reminded Sarah of the first day they'd met, when a scared little girl had looked at her with 2 old eyes and somehow seen past the anger to the love underneath. The desert gives and takes, Ayana said softly, repeating words Sarah had taught her years ago. But sometimes what it gives is worth everything it takes. Sarah nodded, her heart full. Outside their small circle of light, the desert stretched vast and unforgiving, beautiful and harsh, full of dangers and wonders in equal measure. But here on this porch, between these 2 women who had found each other in a sandstorm and created a family out of loss and hope, there was peace. And that, Sarah thought, was enough. When historians tried to trace the beginning of the peace that eventually ended the Apache Wars, they would point to many factors: the changing political climate, the exhaustion of both sides, the practical economics of endless conflict. But those who knew the real story understood it had started much simpler than that, with a white woman who chose love over hatred, with an Apache child who bridged 2 worlds, with a sandstorm that brought them together and a trust that grew stronger than fear. Sarah Beth Carson died at age 73, surrounded by children and grandchildren, both Apache and white, her funeral attended by more than 300 people from both cultures. Her gravestone, carved from red desert sandstone, bore a simple inscription in both English and Apache: Beloved Mother, Bridge Builder, Peacemaker. She taught us that love is stronger than the storm. Ayana, gray-haired now and a grandmother herself, spoke at the ceremony. Her words were translated for those who needed them, but the emotion in her voice needed no translation. She found a lost child in the desert, Ayana said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. But what she really found was a way to heal a broken world. Today, we don't just mourn a life ended. We celebrate a legacy that will echo through generations. As the sun set over the Sonoran Desert, painting the sky in the same colors that had witnessed their first meeting so many years ago, the mixed crowd began to disperse. Apache families mounted their horses. White settlers climbed into their wagons. Children who had grown up playing together exchanged promises to visit soon. And somewhere in the evening wind, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the whisper of an old promise kept. That love, once planted in the hardest ground, could grow into something beautiful enough to change the world. The desert had given and taken, as it always did, but in the end, what it gave was worth everything it took. Sarah Beth Carson never set out to change history. She wasn't a diplomat or a peace negotiator or a politician with grand plans for territorial harmony. She was just a grieving widow who heard a child crying in the aftermath of a storm and chose compassion over caution, love over hatred, healing over revenge. But here's the thing about courage. It doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes it whispers in the voice of a dying child. Sometimes it shows up in the simple decision to choose kindness when the world has given you every reason to choose cruelty. And sometimes, just sometimes, that one choice echoes through generations, changing the course of history in ways no one could have predicted. Think about what Sarah was facing in that moment. She had every right to walk away, every justification for leaving that Apache child to die alone in the desert. Her husband's blood was still fresh in her memory. The image of his mutilated body was burned into her nightmares. The Apache had taken everything from her partner, her future, her faith in basic human decency. According to the law, according to society, according to everything she'd been taught about right and wrong, that child was her enemy. Apache children grew up to be Apache warriors. Apache warriors killed white settlers. It was simple mathematics of survival, the harsh logic of the frontier. But Sarah looked at that dying little girl and saw something else. She saw innocence. She saw suffering. She saw a human being who needed help, regardless of the color of her skin or the culture she'd been born into. And in that moment of choice, Sarah Carson became something more than a victim of frontier violence. She became a bridge builder. The results speak for themselves. Ayanna grew up to become one of the most influential peace negotiators in territorial history, helping to end conflicts that had raged for generations. Her unique upbringing, fluent in multiple languages, comfortable in both cultures, equally at home in an Apache village and a white settlement, made her invaluable in bringing about the treaties that finally ended the Apache Wars. But it wasn't just Ayanna's diplomatic skills that made the difference. It was her very existence as living proof that two worlds could coexist, that Apache and white children could play together, that traditional enemies could become family. That love really was stronger than hate when people were brave enough to choose it. The small community that grew up around Sarah's homestead became a model for what was possible. Apache families and white settlers who had been killing each other for decades found ways to trade, to share knowledge, to help each other survive the harsh realities of desert life. Children grew up bilingual and bicultural, seeing differences as strengths rather than threats. It all started with one moment of choice in the desert heat, when a grieving widow looked at her enemy's child and decided to save rather than abandon. When she chose to see a dying little girl instead of a future threat. When she remembered that mercy isn't weakness, it's the strongest thing a human being can choose. But here's what makes this story even more powerful. Sarah didn't make that choice because she was some kind of saint. She made it because she was human. Because somewhere deep in her heart, beneath all the pain and anger and justified rage, she still remembered what it felt like to be a mother who had lost children. She remembered what it meant to hope. She remembered that love was the only thing that had ever made the hard life of the frontier bearable. Today, in a world still torn by division and fear, Sarah's story hits different, doesn't it? We live in times when it's easier to build walls than bridges, when it's simpler to see enemies than fellow human beings struggling with their own pain and loss, when every news cycle brings fresh reasons to choose fear over hope, anger over understanding, revenge over forgiveness. We're surrounded by voices telling us that showing mercy is weakness, that protecting ourselves means dehumanizing others, that the only way to honor our own pain is to inflict it on someone else. The cycle of hurt and retaliation seems as endless today as it did in 1882 Arizona. But Sarah and Ayanna prove something that echoes across centuries, that bridges between peoples aren't built by governments or treaties. They're built by individuals willing to see past their own trauma to the humanity in others. By people brave enough to choose understanding over anger, even when anger feels completely justified. By ordinary folks who decide that breaking the cycle of violence is more important than perpetuating it. Think about the wars being fought today. The communities divided by race, religion, politics, or history. The families torn apart by ideological differences. The children growing up learning to hate people they've never met because of things that happened before they were born. Now imagine what would happen if just one person in each conflict chose to break the pattern. If just one individual decided to reach across the divide, to show mercy instead of demanding justice, to choose love despite having every reason to choose hate, Sarah Carson wasn't special because she was perfect. She was special because she was broken and chose to heal instead of staying wounded. Because she let her pain teach her compassion instead of cruelty. Because she understood that the best way to honor her husband's memory wasn't to perpetuate the violence that killed him, but to create a world where other wives wouldn't have to bury their husbands. Other children wouldn't have to grow up orphaned by hate. So here's the question that'll keep you up tonight. If you found yourself in Sarah's boots, standing over that dying child with all your own grief and rage burning in your chest, what would you choose? Would you remember every injustice you'd suffered and walk away? Would you let the cycle of hatred continue, justified by all the pain that came before? Would you choose the safety of your own righteous anger over the risk of radical mercy? Or would you do the impossible thing, the thing that defies every instinct for self-preservation and revenge, and choose love over fear? Would you have the courage to bet everything on the possibility that kindness might be stronger than conflict, that healing might be more powerful than hurting? Because here's the truth that Sarah discovered in that desert sandstorm. We all have enemies. We all have reasons to hate. We all carry scars from battles we didn't choose to fight. But we also all have the power to decide whether those scars become sources of wisdom or weapons of destruction. The choice Sarah made isn't ancient history. It's the choice every one of us faces every single day. In our families, our communities, our politics, our hearts. Every time someone hurts us, every time we feel justified in our anger, every time we have the opportunity to show mercy to someone who doesn't deserve it, we're standing in that same desert, looking down at that same dying child, deciding who we're going to be. Because somewhere out there, another storm is brewing. Another lost soul is crying in the wind. Another person exactly like you is going to face that same impossible choice between the darkness of the past and the light of what could be, between being defined by what the world has done to them or defining themselves by what they choose to do for the world. The desert is still giving and taking, but what it gives you depends entirely on what you're willing to plant in the hardest ground of all, the human heart. And the seeds you plant there, mercy or vengeance, love or hate, hope or despair, those seeds will grow into the world your children and grandchildren inherit. Sarah Carson planted love in the hardest ground imaginable. She chose to nurture life in a place where death seemed inevitable. She decided to build bridges in a landscape that seemed designed for division. And because of that choice, hundreds of people lived who might have died. Thousands of conflicts were resolved that might have escalated. Countless children grew up knowing that their identity didn't have to be limited by the circumstances of their birth. What do you think? Could you have made Sarah's choice? Have you ever had to choose between justified anger and difficult mercy? Have you ever been in a position where showing kindness to someone who hurt you felt like betraying yourself? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because these stories matter most when they make us examine our own hearts, when they challenge us to consider what we would do when the world demands we choose between fear and love. And if this tale of impossible courage and unlikely family hits you where it counts, if it made you think about your own capacity for mercy and forgiveness, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because out here in the Wild West, there are still so many untold stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when the world demanded they choose between perpetuating cycles of violence or breaking them with radical acts of love. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're roadmaps for how to be human in impossible circumstances. They're proof that one person's choice to show mercy can ripple across generations, changing the trajectory of entire communities, entire conflicts, entire ways of seeing the world. Tomorrow, we're riding into another chapter of frontier history that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about heroes, villains, and the thin line between survival and humanity. Another story of someone who faced an impossible choice and decided that love was worth the risk. Until then, remember, the greatest battles aren't always fought with guns and glory. Sometimes they're fought in the quiet moments when nobody's watching, when you have to decide what kind of person you're going to be when the storm finally passes, when you have to choose between being defined by your worst moments or defining yourself by your willingness to help others through theirs. The desert teaches hard lessons, but its most important lesson is this. In the harshest places, under the most impossible circumstances, love can still grow. Hope can still flourish. Healing can still happen, but only if someone is brave enough to plant the first seed. Keep your powder dry and your heart open, because the Wild West is still teaching us how to be human. And the frontier, the real frontier, isn't a place on the map. It's the edge between who we've been and who we might become. It's the moment when we choose mercy over revenge, understanding over anger, hope over despair. Sarah Carson found that frontier in a sandstorm. Where will you find yours?